In a year of black swans, an embattled world has to stand up to the unpredictability of President-elect Donald Trump and the vulnerability of his policy options. His trademarks of anti-globalization, anti-elites, anti-establishment,
we must replace the present policy of globalism,
and provocative remarks on Taiwan are a wake-up call.
坚持一个中国原则是发展中美关系的政治基础。
Will politicians in emerging markets choose to forgive him in the coming Trump era? Can an ideologically divided Latin America present a shared society to resonate with President Xi's inclusive Belt and Road Initiative on co-prosperity?
打造互利共赢的命运共同体。
And can Russia and China join hands through President Putin's Euro-Asian Economic Union to rebalance the U.S. pivot to Asia? Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. During the presidential campaign, Donald Trump talked protectionism for U.S. economic policy, saying he would put America first, domestically and around the world. Although many trade experts and economists doubt that Trump can afford to match his words with actions, his rhetoric brings some uncertainty to the global economy. So how should we understand President-elect Donald Trump's recent Twitter pronouncements and cabinet nominations? Is he trying to employ a carrot and stick strategy in Sino-US relations? Will the future of China-US trade reveal a silver lining or bring a potential trade war? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow from Yale University, and James Levinson, Founding Director of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen.
Good to see you, Ray. Thank you.
President-elect Donald Trump says he will put America ahead of everything else. Will that serve the national interest?
Well, those were statements made in the heat of a campaign, and now the campaign is over and the time for governance is at hand. And a lot of us are hoping that the tough campaign rhetoric now gets translated into a more workable way to address the trade and exchange of ideas, goods, and services between nations, especially the United States and China.
Ever in each of his predecessors, since 1972 perhaps, Richard Nixon would always prioritize the national interests of the United States bluntly, openly, without any secrets. But why did President-elect Donald make it clear this time around? Are there any differences between his prioritizing the American interest and what his predecessors did for the same purpose?
I think all of our presidents and people running for the office have had some notion of the national interest at the forefront, but different candidates have put that into policy in very, very different ways.
Do you think this rhetoric would fuel a sense of trade protectionism that amounts to anti-globalization and would be very harmful for the national interest of the United States? Because for any trade war, there would be no winners at all.
I agree, but there's a risk of it. We can't dismiss it. And the point is, Ray, that this has not occurred in a vacuum. We are now more than 8 years into the post-crisis recovery, and it's a recovery that has been the weakest economic recovery in modern U.S. economic history. And Donald Trump was elected out of his ability to send a message to the disaffected who remain on the outside looking in from this economic recovery. And they have problems with trade, they have problems with globalization, they have problems with job security and real wage increases. And I think he still feels that this is a core constituency that he wants to address in his policies, and if it means taking risks on trade policy that would border on protectionism, at least at this point, he is prepared to take those risks.
I think that's right, but it's going to be very hard for President-elect Trump to deliver on his promises to bring jobs back home. I don't think that, I agree with what Steve said. I don't think that at the end of the day, the president is going to be able to bring jobs back. even if he implements tariffs, he can bring production back, perhaps, but production is not the same as jobs anymore.
Despite the scathing criticisms that he had on the campaign trail, many would come up to him and say, hey, Mr. President-elect, I'm ready to help. Now, those are what we call in Chinese 拍马屁, to do whatever to please your boss, your new boss. But taking Japanese tech giant SoftBank as an example, this guy promised to pour $50 billion into the US and is expected to create 50,000 domestic jobs in the process. Do you think this would be the silver lining and would lead by real example?
Okay, it's the question that, of course, comes up is, did this plan by Masa-san of SoftBank, was it sparked by his relationship with Donald Trump, or was this a plan that had been in the works for a long time prior to the election? I believe the answer is this has been a strategy that had been developed quite some time ago. But the idea of a president brokering job creation, company by company, as my colleague just alluded to, is ludicrous. There are much broader forces that will shape the role of industry both at home and abroad. Globalization is not just about bilateral trade, it's about multilateral supply chains and companies making parts of goods and even services all over the world, in places like China, but also in South America and Eastern Europe. And to disrupt that process brings inefficiencies into the nature of production and the value chain that ultimately ends up taxing the consumers who enjoy the benefits of these efficiencies. And that's a very difficult process to untangle.
Not only SoftBank, but the Foxconn, which does assembly line for iPhone and Apple products of Tim Cook, also, it's a rumor that has not been confirmed independently yet, also promises to take the jobs back. Do you think this will become a general trend?
I think it's too early
It's
to
too
tell.
early to predict and tell precisely what's going to happen.
These huge investments typically don't happen overnight. As my colleague Steve alluded to, businesses typically plan these types
But the next immediate question, I'm
ahead.
afraid, gentlemen, is whether the United States is ready for yet another industrial revolution in the Rust Belt. For example, for years you've been too reliant on the quick development of service industry. I mean, what's going to happen to those blue-collar workers? Are they trained? Are they ready to be involved in the what we call reindustrialization of the U.S. economy?
Look, it's hard to recapture old magic. I think the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurialism as it exists in Silicon Valley or in other technology corridors in the United States is forward-looking. And the idea to bring back the old way of doing it in the Rust Belt really is very much at odds with, I think, a forward-looking, innovative-driven culture that will uncover new ways to do new things as opposed to the way that we used to do it. And this will require us to have the wherewithal to invest in talent, to invest in our educational system, and to make certain that workers are equipped with the skills that they need to develop these new and exciting things. And that's a challenge for China, too.
I agree, but it takes a long time. And when people in their late 40s or 50s lose their manufacturing jobs, I don't think we have good answers. In the United States, the most common job in roughly 39 of the 50 states, the most common job title is a truck driver. And over the next 5 to 10 years, we will be seeing driverless trucks. It's 1.5 million jobs that are likely to disappear. And I don't think we have an answer to that. Yet, it's an important issue.
Gentlemen, I want to bring you back from the broad questions and analysis on domestic economy on both sides across the Pacific Ocean to the initial concern of this program, that is whether a trade war is likely to break out between the United States and China. Stephen, you said Trump's protectionist agenda will not work in practice because the United States and China are now completely dependent upon each other. You also believe the lack of savings in the U.S. will make it even more reliant on China if Trump pursues an expansionist fiscal policy to invest money in infrastructure.
The point is the following. The United States has a very low aggregate savings rate. And under the Trump economic policies, that savings rate is going to go even lower because of the expansion of budget deficits coming from tax cuts and massive fiscal expenditures. When we don't have enough savings to grow, we import surplus savings from abroad, we run big current account and trade deficits to attract the foreign capital. Trumponomics, as we call it in the United States, is synonymous with me with wider trade deficits. And for a president who's advocating getting tough on trade at a time when our deficits are expanding, that is a risky proposition, and I think raises the possibility of either higher U.S. interest rates or even, believe it or not, a weaker dollar. The dollar is stronger right now, but it may not hold up that well if our trade deficits get wider.
And your take?
No, I very much agree with what Steve just said. I think he has it exactly right.
Do you think the inflation of your fiscal budget deficit will fuel and make the problems even worse in the next 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency? Because tax cuts and the expansionist budget will make the problem worse on the surface of the problem.
I do think that the increased deficits that Trump's plan likely entails are going to be a problem, either for Trump or for the person he hands it off to.
But by the end of the day, he would find himself always asking the same question, the creation of jobs. So do you think he has to slap a 45% punitive tariff on Chinese imports to the United States? And do you think that will help?
I think that's a crazy idea. And no, I don't think it will help. I think if President Trump implemented large tariffs on Chinese goods, we would instead import those same goods from Vietnam or other places. So I think it's both counterproductive and ineffective.
Giving up the one China policy would also help as a bargaining chip in its business transactions with mainland China. I mean, this has caused an uproar in the media coverage about what's going to happen across the Taiwan Strait.
I fully understand the one China policy, but I don't know why we have to be bound by a one China policy unless we make a deal with China.
Will he succeed in using Taiwan as a part of the trade?
No one knows.
No one knows.
But it's an example
Is it a
of
wise policy? Is it
I don't think it is. I think that the one-child policy has been a foundational bedrock of the diplomacy that has been built up by over 40 years between our two countries. On the other hand, what Mr. Trump is simply sending a message to China on this is that there is dissatisfaction within his perception of the political relations between the two countries on the status quo. And he wants to change the relationship. So by going for the most sensitive aspect of that relationship, the Taiwan issue, he is serving notice on China. I do not believe that he is going to repudiate the one-child policy, nor do I believe he will do things that will escalate this into a more serious issue.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow from Yale University, and James Levinson, Founding Director of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. We're discussing new economic policies of President-elect Trump in the next 4 years. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Okay, welcome back, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Some of the key hallmarks that characterize what is called the anti-globalization policy of President-elect Trump are, for example, his rejection of TPP, and he demands a renegotiation about NAFTA. TTIP has basically failed, according to the European Union. Now, Does it indicate that the United States wants to beat a retreat from the Asia-Pacific region? That's at least the concern of Tokyo, which says China would assume regional leadership. Do you think that's likely to help?
I think we will be debating this for a long time. I personally do not believe that despite Mr. Trump's strong argument for America first, that the United States is about to retreat from the global stage. I think there is an objection that was expressed politically in the campaign that he's acting on that has lost confidence in multilateral trade deals because of the damage that is perceived to be showing up on middle-class American and other workers who have lost their jobs because of the powerful forces of globalization. And I think we said this earlier, we as economists and policymakers have to do a better job in designing policies that can address these concerns. But I don't think that's an excuse for the United States to abandon its global role in any way whatsoever.
Then what's the roadmap of Mr. Trump?
I'm not sure Mr. Trump knows the roadmap of Mr. Trump. We have a saying in English, the dog that caught the bus. And it refers to the dog that chases the bus every day when the bus goes by. And then one day it catches the bus and it says, oh my gosh, what do I do next? And I think on a lot of these issues...
This could be very dangerous. This year witnesses the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, when Mikhail Gorbachev first took office, he put on table two slogans. One was glasnost, the other perestroika. He wanted to reform the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And he wasn't very sure. He wasn't certain what he wanted to have in the end. But what happened eventually was disintegration of the former Soviet Union. I'm not drawing a parallel comparison between former Soviet Union, which was called by Ronald Reagan the evil empire, and the superpower, the United States, the winner of the Cold War. I'm talking about uncertainty and unpredictability and the harms that they would bring about in any serious bilateral negotiations between the two biggest economies, China and the United States. What do you think of the implications here?
There are tensions between the two countries, and the tensions reflect economic forces, political concerns that have certainly risen to the surface in the United States. And there are risks associated with these tensions that are playing out right now. But there are also opportunities. And I think,
for example?
Well, China is shifting its growth model to more of a domestic demand model, expanding products and services for Chinese consumers. The consumption share of the Chinese economy is about half what it is in the U.S. The U.S. has an opportunity to participate in the expansion of domestic Chinese markets if we can reach agreement on market access through a bilateral investment treaty. And I've been a big advocate of leaders like Mr. Trump and Xi Jinping of finally saying enough of this 8-year negotiation process, and let's reach agreement and move ahead in a way that benefits both countries and the companies in both countries. So rather than viewing the relationship as a risk, this frames the relationship as a win-win opportunity for both.
It's common sense for a CEO on both sides, China and the United States, to have a win-win situation, pursuing co-prosperity instead of a zero-sum game in a trade war. However, I was told that negotiations about BIT are grinding to a halt.
Well, they have. We've had, I think, 25 rounds of negotiations over 8 years where we agree on the core principles.
But it's shorter than our negotiations about China's entry into the WTO, which was more like a marathon talk. right?
We're used to
communication.
marathons, but okay, the time...
You have been enslaved by domestic politics, I'm afraid, becoming less patient than Barashevsky's negotiation and her role in the WTO
Trade
negotiations.
negotiations are extremely complex. TPP is a case in point, but a bilateral investment treaty right now, the holdup is simply on the so-called negative list. Which industries are sensitive and should be excluded from market access. There have been 3 rounds of exchanging negative lists, and the progress has been disappointing, and we're not there. Under a new U.S. administration, if the man is the deal maker that he claims to be, close the door, do the deal. Don't leave until you agree on a negative list. And I would say the same thing to my counterparts in China.
15 years ago, when China was finally admitted to the WTO, it was attributed to the political will of President Jiang Zemin and Premier Zhu Rongji. Today, perhaps the political will also matters. Having said this, to my pro knowledge about what's going on within the framework of BIT negotiations, 2 critical issues do matter. James. One is national security, which is often cited by our American friends in rejecting Chinese merger and acquisition. A third is perhaps high-tech transfer. And China complains for years that due to the Cold War mentality, the United States still refused to export sensitive high technology or products related to such high technology. And that has caused a severe loss on your side in your exports to the Chinese market. So James and Stephen, I mean, can you be honest and frank about this long-standing problem between the 2 sides? Who is to blame?
What do you think,
This
Steve?
is obviously a difficult problem for your brilliant guys. Is this
Look,
also an aspect
the
of trade
technology
protectionism?
complaint from China is one that I have personally heard in discussions with Chinese officials for over 15 years. And yet, so much of the design and product and intellectual capital associated with technology breakthroughs is openly available. And I think there has been some, I know there has been some moderation in the products that are classified as sensitive from a technological point of view by the U.S. Commerce Department. And I think the United States is prepared to go forward in opening that up. There will be limits, as there are in China, as to how far we're willing to go. But I think these are the types of issues that we have definitely seen movement on, and we'll need to see more movement going forward.
President-elect Trump has offered to reject the TPP as well as the climate change agreement that was reached in Paris with China. Now, would that be also viewed as not just a setback for President Obama, but a very devastating blow to the image of the United States that could also be an important aspect of trade protectionism one way or another?
So I view those 2 issues a little bit differently. I think that TPP is essentially dead on arrival. Mm-hmm. That one's done.
Hillary also rejected TPP.
It was a tough political sell.
She may have come back to it.
But she may have come back to it. We won't know that. I don't see President-elect Trump reviving TPP. The climate change accords, to my thinking, are in some way much more important, because you can postpone TPP and come back to it in 4 years or 3 years if the environment is different. But my understanding of the science of climate change is such that it's not so easy to undo the damage that's done. So I find the...
But he thinks the science is made in China.
I find President-elect Trump's policy on climate change deeply disturbing, and the cabinet that he has selected is equally disturbing on that front.
What would be the
It's scary.
consequences arising from President-elect Trump's breach of the agreement?
Well, I think it's very clear. The Paris Accord, as I understand it, requires 55% of all the carbon emitters to agree on implementation. if the U.S. were to pull out, we wouldn't be at 55%, and the entire accord would be at risk of unraveling. There's a lot of talk right now by China and others that, well, we were very upset about the United States potentially resisting it, but we're going to go ahead anyway. Under the agreed terms of the Paris Accord, if the United States, which is now the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, lost its first place ranking to China a number of years ago, if we were to pull out, there would not be that threshold that would keep this agreement in force. And I think the rest of the world needs to be aware of that as well.
The last question, gentlemen, is that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rate, and we have been accused of manipulating the RMB. Do you see any relationship? What kind of impact would that deliver to the currency, RMB, for example? Will the pace of internationalization or internationalizing RMB slow down deliberately as a result?
I won't make any predictions about what will or won't happen with the RMB. I do believe that the United States will continue to raise interest rates. They're so low that at some level there is only one direction they could go. And with President Trump-elect's policies being probably quite expansionary, it doesn't surprise me that the Fed raised rates and will probably do so.
Will the interest rate hike, Stephen, cause more of the outbound flight of capital? They will not invest in China, and it will be harmful for both sides.
There's a risk of that. There is an issue right now in China
dollar.
about
what the strong dollar means.
About this confluence of forces with the capital outflows, the sharp decline in official foreign exchange reserves from 4 to 3 trillion, and the related weakening of the RMB. The government has moved recently to impose temporarily some capital controls over outbound capital, and that if it continues does raise some concerns that I have about the internationalization of the RMB and broader financial reforms in China. So this is an area that I, as an optimist on China, are watching very carefully right now.
So very quickly, just with a few words from both of you, hopefully, do you think the United States and China are actually in the same boat? We cannot do without each other, and we're going to be more of a commonwealth, if not for the same
I wrote
destination.
a book on the codependency of the United States and China 2 years ago. I believe that we are dependent on China, China is dependent on us. But in a codependent relationship, if one partner changes the rules, there are consequences for the other, and the other lashes out and reacts. And we're at that, I think, a very delicate point in our codependency right now.
You know, in Chinese we call it 一损俱损，一荣俱荣. That's the dream of Red Mansion by Cao Xueqin. Well, Dr. Henry Kissinger calls it co-evolution. Do you buy this idea?
I do believe that the two countries are quite codependent. And what Steve said strikes me as being right on target. Things are more complicated now than they were about a month ago, but I remain hopeful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In the wake of the telephone gate with Tsai Ing-wen, I'm afraid more from both sides would realize and achieve a consensus that we are increasingly interdependent in our pursuit of a co-prosperity across the Pacific Ocean, which is big enough, hopefully, to accommodate the needs of the two biggest economies in the world. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.